Hello listeners, I am Dr. Jay Singh, Associate Professor, Department of English Literature, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. I am before you to speak on India in Western Imagination, a literary review, which is part of the SWAYAM course, Introduction to Indian Literature in English, Colonialism to Post-Colonialism. India and West has a quite old relationship, older than the presence of East India Company in India. However, the direct relationship between India and West started with the entry of East India Company in India and later on with the establishment of East India Company as ruler in India. Large number of scholars were employed to translate Indian text and India entered the imagination of large number of Western writers. The first Governor General, Warren Hastings, patronized a group of young and well educated company writers who increasingly devoted their energies to Sanskrit, believing that it held the key to a vast store of Indian knowledge. They established institutions specifically devoted for this purpose. These institutions were central in shaping and transmitting the increasingly organized body of knowledge produced during the first 3 decades of company rule, which can also be called company Orientalism. Central to their educational program was the research produced by Europeans and Indians attached to the learned societies that had emerged in the colonial port towns, especially the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was founded in 1784. This society provided a crucial institutional framework for the elaboration of British studies in Indian languages, religion and politics. It was a venue where Sir William Jones, the prime force behind the establishment of the society and its first president, reshaped the understanding of the relationship between European and Indian languages and cultures. Sir William Jones' comparative work on Asian and European languages was the most important strand of British Indology and perhaps European Orientalism more generally in the 18th century. Therefore, he is called the father of comparative linguistics and Indo-European studies. Sir William Jones' Sanskrit studies had a broader utility than he initially anticipated, because they reshaped his vision of language, history and ethnology, and not only his vision, but the vision of entire Europe. In February 1786, he delivered his 3rd anniversary discourse titled On the Hindus to the Asiatic Society. This paper was the first in a series of essays that explored the evidence for and nature of Asian ethnography and history. Henry Thomas Colebrook, a key figure in the company's educational and judicial apparatus, also pursued the project started by Sir William Jones, a company writer in Madras from 1783. Colebrook rapidly mastered Sanskrit and he was appointed the first inaugural professor of Sanskrit at Fort Williams College. In 1808, he compiled his Sanskrit dictionary for the Fort Williams students. Thus, company Orientalism, exemplified and started by Sir William Jones and William Colebrook, created a Sanskritocentric vision of Indian culture that celebrated Sanskrit and the Vedas, but decried contemporary culture as debased and backward. This Sanskritocentric image of Indian language and culture had a significant impact on the European imagination and European thought in the late 18th and 19th centuries. However, its influence was uneven and took on a variety of forms as the structure of academic institutions, the place of language in developing senses of national identity, and the divergent political forces shaped the European reception of this discovery of Sanskrit and the Vedas, although its impact in England itself was both delayed and much less than it was in Germany. George Foster was central in knitting together German Romanticism, Pacific studies and Orientalism. His translation of Sir William Jones' Latin rendering of the Sanskrit play Shakuntala was central in starting the age of Indomania in Germany. India became a key source for German Romanticism as the importance of philology and a romantic desire for spiritual renewal in Germany reinforced and enlarged on the Sanskritocentric approach of Sir William Jones and Colebrooke. And very interestingly, Shakuntala was seen as a very romantic story in Germany because a young girl is given a choice to find her life partner. Later on, when Rabindranath Tagore wrote the introduction to this play in India, he called it a story of sin and redemption. So, all romanticism disappears when Shakuntala comes back to India, but in Germany it was seen as a romantic story. According to James P. Rice, the discovery by the West of Sanskrit extended over several centuries and involved primarily missionary scholars from all over Europe. For many years, the principal Vedic texts, the four Vedas and the Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, which includes the Upanishads, trickled into European centers of learning, according to James P. Rice. This scholarship was not used just for academic purposes, but for administrative purposes as well. Schwab, a renowned Orientalist scholar, discusses this relationship between academic and administration when he says, the decisive period of Indic studies began with the arrival of English civil servants in Calcutta around 1780, who, supported by the Governor Warren Hastings, began an extraordinary undertaking. Learning does not determine its own course alone, and the initial intention, conversion, yielded to or was intermingled with another intention, that is conquest. The aim of this period was no longer to clear a path for knowledge, but for administration. This is the relationship between administration and academics in those days. Similarly, Max Muller, in a letter to his wife, talks about the impact of Orientalist project on the Indians. When we talk about Max Muller, we have a lot of respect for Max Muller because he praises India and Indians. He wrote an essay, What India Can Teach Us. But when he writes letters to his wife and his friends, a completely different picture comes before us. When he writes a letter to his wife, that this edition of mine and the translation of the Veda will hereafter tell to a great extent on the fate of India and on the growth of millions of souls in that country. It is the root of their religion, and to show them what that root is, I feel sure, the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it during the last 3000 years. In another letter written to the Duke of Agril, he hints at the close relationship between the Orientalist project that consolidated the empire by canonizing the texts which earlier belonged to a particular caste only, and he says, India has become conquered once, but India must be conquered again, and that second conquest should be a conquest by education, by encouraging a study of their own ancient literature as part of their education. So, translating Indian texts becomes a part of imperial machinery and adds to the conquest. After discussion on the theoretical framework behind imagination of India in the West, let us study the images of India in Western literature. The images of India in the British literature are numerous, starting from Chaucer's time. The images of India were travelling from India to England through East India Company officials. H. G. Rawlinson, in his research paper titled Indian Influence on Western Culture, foregrounds that the folk stories of Indian origin are found in both Chaucer and Shakespeare, and he refers to Chaucer's Square's Tale and foregrounds the following lines. These lines are from Square's Tale by Chaucer. Story of Cambuscan bold that owned the virtuous ring of glass and the wondrous horse of brass, on which the Tatar king did ride. Professor A. MacDonald accepts that this story has Indian origin. The contact between England and India was established with the foundation of the British factory at Surat, and one of the earliest writers to show a detailed knowledge of India is John Milton in his Paradise Lost. He mentions Indian cities when he says, I will read a line from Paradise Lost, to Agra and Lahore of great Mughal. This is what John Milton writes in his Paradise Lost. It means Indian lifestyle, Indian cities, Indian geography is firing his imagination, is putting his imagination on fire. The Milton family is of city merchants, and no doubt they frequently came across members of the East India Company. There is a reason to suppose that John Milton was a friend of William Methwold, the scholar president of Surat factory from 1633 to 1639. John Milton had obviously read contemporary travel books like The Embassy of Sir Thomas Roe. Sir Thomas Roe was the British ambassador in the court of Jahangir, and in his book Embassy, he gives us an image of the court of Jahangir, and that image is replicated by John Milton in his second book of Paradise Lost when he describes Saturn in the following words. High on a throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormus and of Ind, or where the gorgeous East with richest hand showers on her kings barbaric pearl and gold. This image seems to be inspired by Sir Thomas Roe's narrative of his first meeting with the Emperor Jahangir, whom he describes as high in a gallery with a canopy over him and a carpet before him, set in great and barbarous state with great Mughal. It was only after the discovery of Sanskrit by European scholars at the end of the 18th century that India began to exercise a direct influence on European imagination and European thought. Warren Hastings originally encouraged the English officials to take up the subject in order to get a clearer idea of the continents of the Hindu law books, but this led to the opening up of a new world. The first translation of the great Hindu philosophical poem, the Bhagavad Gita, was made by Sir Charles Wilkins in 1785, and 4 years later, Sir William Jones astonished the world with his rendering of Kalidasa's masterpiece Shakuntala that I have discussed earlier. In 1802, Alexander Hamilton, an Indian civil servant who was detained on his way home for 3 years in Paris by the outbreak of war, passed his time by teaching Sanskrit to his fellow prisoners. Among his pupils was Friedrich von Schlegel from Germany, who did for Sanskrit in Germany what Sir William Jones had done in England. In his Language and Wisdom of the Indians in 1808, he asserted the intellectual affinity of Europe and Asia. His brother August Wilhelm produced a translation of the Ramayana in 1829 to 1831. The poet Heine, greatly struck by what he called the immense flowering forest of old Indian poetry, declared that he felt completely at home in Valmiki's jungle of song, and the suffering of the godlike Rama touched a familiar chord in his heart. Many of his finest lyrics are inspired by Indian thought and imagery. Hegel broke into a paean, a kind of poem of praise over the Bhagavad Gita. The passage in Schiller, Maria Stuart, in which the exiled queen calls upon the clouds to take her greetings to the land of her birth, is obviously inspired by a similar passage in Kalidasa's Meghdut, that is Cloud Messenger. Goethe was somewhat repelled by the bizarre complexity and bewildering anomalies of Sanskrit, but greeted Shakuntala in the following lines. What he says about Kalidasa Shakuntala: "Wouldst thou the young year's blossoms and the fruits of its decline, and all by which the soul is charmed, enraptured, feasted, fed? Wouldst thou the earth and heaven itself in one sole name combine? I name thee, O Shakuntala, and all at once is said." There is a little doubt that the pantheistic transcendentalism, which forms the core of the philosophy of Carlyle, Coleridge, Wordsworth and Shelley, owes a great deal to Hindu influence indirectly imbibed through the medium of German. Professor R. M. Havitt traces P. B. Shelley's Oriental pantheism to Sir William Jones, whose fine hymen of the Hindu deity once had a great vogue. He shows in particular that P. B. Shelley's hymen to intellectual beauty is directly inspired by Sir William Jones' hymen to Narayana, and when we compare both poems, we can find the similarity. First, I will read a few lines from Sir William Jones' hymen to Narayana. "Spirit of spirits, who through every part of space expanded and of endless time, beyond the stretch of labouring thought sublime, baddest uproar into beauteous order start. Before heaven vast thou art, a sphere beneath us rolled, or spheres above. Our earth is firmamental ether hung, thou sattest alone, till through thy mystic love things unexistent to existence sprung, and grateful descent sung." Now, I will read a few lines from P. B. Shelley's poem. "Spirit of beauty that dost consecrate with thine own hues all thou dost shine upon, of human thought, or form where art thou gone? Why dost thou pass away and leave our state, this dim vast vale of tears, vacant and desolate?" When we compare both the poems, we find the similarity. Indian influence is pronounced in the transcendental movement in America and the Celtic revival in Ireland as well. Of the former, which started as a protest against New England Puritanism, it has been said that the prophet was Emerson and his high priestess Margaret Fuller. Emerson knew no Sanskrit, but he had studied the Hindu scriptures in translation, which is evident from his poem Brahma. What he says in his poem Brahma: "If the red slayer thinks he slays, or if the slain thinks he is slain, then know not well the subtle ways. I keep and pass and turn again. Far or forget to me is near. Shadow and sunlight are the same. The vanished gods to me appear, and one to me arc, shame and fame." This is inspired by a well-known passage in Katha Upanishad, which says, "When the slayer imagines that he kills, when the slain imagines that he dies, both are under delusion. The spirit of the slayer does not kill, the spirit of the slain does not die." This is what Katha Upanishad says, and both have a lot of similarity. Hinduism was popularized in Dublin Circle by Theosophical Society, which had a great vogue in the 90s and particularly affected A. E. Russell and W. B. Yeats. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Indian art had many Western admirers. Professor Saak has investigated the influence of Mughal paintings on art of Rembrandt, who painted the portrait of Abraham Wildermonk, a director of the East India Company and a great enthusiast of Indian art. Among Rembrandt's drawings in the British Museum are copies of portrait of Timur, the Emperor Jahangir, and an Indian prince on horseback. Warren Hastings and his contemporaries were enthusiasts in Indian art. Warren Hastings' collection of Mughal paintings was purchased by the East India Company for £760 in 1809. The collection of Indian sculpture made by his friend General Stuart was acquired by the British Museum. Sir Joshua Reynolds was another admirer of Indian painting, expressed his delight when shown in 1777 the album of Mughal portraits, also now in the British Museum. In the 19th century, there was a general blindness in England to the significance of Indian art, and even Sir George Birdwood denied that India had any fine art. So, this is the sudden change over a century. Art which was seen great is now seen no art at all, and Sir George Birdwood denied that India had any art. Ruskin, lecturing to the South Kensington Museum in 1855, declared that Indian art either forms its compositions out of meaningless fragments of color and showings of line, or if it represents any living creature, it represents that creature under some distorted or monstrous form. To all facts and forms of nature, it willfully and resolutely opposes itself. It will not draw a man, but an 8-armed monster. It will not draw a flower, but only a spiral or zigzag. The imagination of India in the Western literature is not fixed, rather it has been changing constantly depending upon the power relations. During the English Romantic period, creative writers often felt the allure of India. That allure is evident in poems like Robert Southey's The Curse of Khema, Thomas More's Lalla Rookh, The Indian Boat, The Indian Young Maid, The East Indian, Lord Gordon Byron's The Irish Avatar, and Stanza to a Hindu Air, P.B. Shelley's Janib and Khetma, Prometheus Unbound, Aleister, and The Indian Serenade, John Keats' Endymion, and S. T. Coleridge's fragments from the Night Scene and Osorio. The writings of the minor writers of the pre-Romantic and Romantic period give further insight into the intensity of the literary interest in India. Few readers have heard of poems like I am going to Bombay by Thomas Hood, The Indian City by Felicia Dorothea Lady Morgan, or even The Spirit of Discovery by Sea by Reverend Leslie Bowles. Collectively, these works exemplify a literary characteristic of the Romantic period that results from the cross-cultural relationship of the British and Indian colonization and the Oriental Renaissance of the 18th century. In isolation, each work relates a personal story of a writer's cross-cultural encounter with Indian civilization. Different Romantic poets had different kind of understanding and relationship with India, as they imagine India differently. For instance, Robert Southey in his Curse of Khema imagine Indian culture negatively. According to Robert Southey, Khema is a dreadful one, and his pride is amplified by his Easterners for definable empirical reasons. One need only a glance at the poem's preface to get the taste of Southey's scathing opinion of Indian culture. What he writes in the preface: in the religion of the Hindus, which of all false religions is the most monstrous in its fables and the most fatal in its effects. However, his ideas are not accepted by all Romantics. Different Romantic poets had different imagination of India. For instance, John Keats' Orient was interwoven with an explicit theorization of two already interrelated subjects: modernity's belatedness to Greek antiquity and the poetic imagination. Given the centrality of these concerns in John Keats' work, this appropriation and sublimation is what happens in the famous Indian maiden passage in Endymion in 1818, where the Oriental other is a mere step towards the poet's dreamer's spiritualization. Endymion's sweet Indian, there is a term sweet Indian used in Endymion, a guise of the goddess Diana Cynthia is seamlessly and uncritically woven into the poem. Greek mythology, via the workings of the poetic imagination, all myth is subsumed beneath Greek myth, and the Greek myth is subsumed beneath the workings of the dream. In a poem concluding book, the instance Endymion beheld awake his very dream and asked him, swans of Ganga, to let us no more breathe this murky phantasm. When he moves to kiss her hand, he says, horror, kiss his own, he was alone. Proof that even Endymion's choice of the human known divine maiden was still a projection of his own desires. In the 20th century, after World War I, there is again renewed interest in India, and India is imagined as a home to spiritualism that can provide solution to the problems caused by the Western civilization. W. B. Yeats was deeply influenced by Indian mythology and Indian occult, and this influence was clearly visible on his poetry. For instance, in his poem The Second Coming, when he writes, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Revelation is at hand. What rough beast slouches towards Bethlehem to born? W. B. Yeats transforms Sir John's vision of the coming of the Antichrist into a fearful image of an avatara of Vishnu, that is Narsimha Avatara. In 1934, W. B. Yeats wrote a remarkable sonnet titled Meru. Meru is a mythical Hindu mountain of the spiritual realization. Indian influences, both Hindu and Buddhist, are scattered everywhere in the work of the British American-born poet, critic, dramatist T. S. Eliot. For example, the three Shantis, peace blessings, Data, Dayadavam, Damyata. Data, to give, Dayadavam, to be compassionate, Damyata, to be in self-control. In his poem, The Wasteland, are very important. These lines in the poem converts this poem into an extension of Upanishad, for in the Indian tradition only Upanishads are permitted the triple benediction at the end. While acknowledging the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, according to Professor P. Lal, T. S. Eliot changes the advice of Prajapati to the three kinds of intelligent forms who come to him as disciples: gods, anti-gods and man. Professor P. Lal, in his study, foregrounds that in 1944, the Dry Salvages section of the four quartets by T. S. Eliot sets forth the advice given by Krishna to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. There are lines from this poem: do not think of the fruit of the action. This is what Krishna says to Arjuna. T. S. Eliot may have been talking here to the allied soldiers in the battlefield of Britain. T. S. Eliot was A. R. P. Warden. Was he trying to say that one should fight, but forget that one is fighting to save democracy from Nazism and fascism? The doubt lingers in T. S. Eliot when he says, these are again the lines from the Dry Salvages, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant. Fare forward, not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers. May not even that, but just fare on. Who can tell if our faring is linear in the western sense of time or circular in the eastern sense, karma? To conclude, we can say that India, though colonized by the British, but India influenced them through the soft power, the power of culture, the power of philosophy. Both civilizations interacted with each other and learned from each other. So, with these words, I will like to conclude my talk. Thank you.